So Dr. Ananya, could you just tell us about your PhD?
So my PhD, I did it at the University of Chicago. I defended in 2012. It's called The Empire of Apostles, Jesuits in Brazil and India in the 16th and 17th century. The project sort of follows the career of 6 key figures in the order from the mid-16th to the 17th century in Brazil and Portuguese India. And I'm sort of interested in the intersection of religion and empire in the project. And one of the
Religion
figures,
and empire.
And one of the figures that I work on is Thomas Stephens. And
Anyone else in Goa?
I work also on Xavier
Okay.
and somebody not from the Goan mission, Balthazar da Costa, who worked in the Madurai mission. So those are the figures that I focus on from.
And you were telling us something fascinating about Thomas Stephens. What kind of a person does he come across?
Thomas Stephens strikes me. I mean, part of the challenge with working with a figure like Thomas Stephens is that in the order itself, he never rose to a very high level, in the sense that he seemed to have been a very self-effacing person. And I think at least part of that is to do with his early formation as a Catholic in a period in English history where Catholicism was increasingly being driven underground. And so his sort of apprenticeship, he seems to have sort of wandered around with a much more vocal and richer patron, a Catholic. And then eventually he escapes, he goes to Rome, he joins the order, and then he comes to Goa. But he seems to have maintained at least some of that experience in how he approaches conversion in Goa. So, he's much
He's different from the Portuguese?
I don't know if he's different. He does have a sense of his own, sort of distinction as an Englishman. I mean, in the 1590s, you really start to see the rise of national rivalries within the Jesuit order. So this is largely between the Portuguese and the Italians. So there's a big issue with Valignano and the local Goan province, and there are kind of more national rivalries emerging in the order at this time. But Stephens is generally a fairly self-effacing character, and his own experience of persecution, I think, leads him to be sensitive to what persecution can do. So when he observes the Concolain massacre, he's very careful to say in his letter, the reason why this happened is because of things we did. So he talks about the fact that Petroberno has the worst and most humiliating violence because he had done the most humiliating things in the destruction of the Hindu temple. And his approach to conversion, the fact that he wants to use accommodatio, translating Christian knowledge into local cultural and linguistic terms, is, I think, partly born of that experience.
Then the Kristapurana comes about.
Yes, so he starts working on it, and I think in a period he starts working on it long before it's eventually published. He tries to first have it published in Nagari characters, but he misunderstands the way that the alphabet works in terms of printing, and what he conveys to Rome would make it seem almost impossible to print. So he's given permission to publish in Roman character. But I think personally, I mean, the issue of authorship in this period was very different from the way authorship works now.
So you were mentioning that it's probably co-authored?
So in the sense that, Stephens is certainly an integral person in the creation of this text, but we must think of this text as not the creation of one person. It's really a co-produced text, and the people who produced it with him are the Brahmin converts that he works with, and primarily I think in Margao.
It's complex.
The text itself is so rich, and the poetry is beautiful. It's really extraordinarily sophisticated.
So he couldn't have achieved it.
That is at least part of the reason I think it's not a sole created text, because you have examples in the later 17th century. So, for example, Antonio de Saldanha's hagiography of Saint Anthony of Padua. The poetry is clearly of an inferior order. The poetry in the Kristapurana is so elusive. There are sections that without deep knowledge of the Marathi literary tradition, starting from the Jnaneshwari, there's no way somebody could have written that.
So he incorporates not only Jnaneshwari but also
There are inflections of many other poets, I think, within the Marathi tradition, which suggests to me that he co-produced this with very literary, educated converts.
this theory that we were just talking about it, that a letter from him could have attracted British interest in India as a whole. Believable?
I'm a bit chary of that without seeing explicit evidence. I would be chary of it partly for the simple reason that Catholics were in a very vulnerable position. So how far a Catholic letter would be widely circulated is difficult to ascertain. Certainly, it would have brought untoward attention to the community. Because of course he's writing as a missionary, and these are letters that include information about missionary enterprise. So to that extent, I'm a bit chary to say that. Without explicit evidence, I would not be willing to make that claim. Certainly, he seems to have, because of cultural reasons, been more willing to put a hand out to, people who were not from his religion at that point, Protestants. So, for example, when a group of Englishmen in the first English sort of mercantile mission is sent towards Goa.
Which year?
This is in the early 17th century. No, late 16th century. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't remember the exact date. But these men are arrested in the Gulf of Arabia and then brought to Goa, and Stephens would visit them often, and so it might even have created a difficult situation for him because these men eventually escaped. They ran away.
I see.
But he seems to have interceded on their behalf, even though they were Protestants, but because they were English. So these kinds of
nuances are there.
Nuances are there, absolutely. But what I find so interesting about the Kristapurana is the way it takes on a life of its own. So one of the most interesting things I found was when I worked in the Marsden collection in the SOAS library. This has one of the earliest known Nagari scripts, the manuscripts of the Purana, which I would date to the early 18th century or so. And it's in two scribal hands. What is really fascinating, it largely corresponds to what other texts show, but there is one enormous omission. Now, in the original, there is in the Kristapurana, there is a chapter on Jesus' first miracle, where he turns water into wine at the wedding at Cana. And there is a superb apologia for the Christian ritual use of alcohol, including making it clear that this is not like sort of low caste, and that's very clear. It's low caste alcoholism in the villages. It's not like that. It ends by saying, the bhakti of the Brahmins is like the water they drink, nirguna. But our bhakti is like the wine we drink. It's full of rasa and color, and it's and warmth. So it's a wonderful chapter. That entire chapter is missing in this manuscript, which to me suggests that this was a manuscript that the convert communities themselves produced and circulated, and in all likelihood, they were probably Brahmins and didn't like this kind of reference to alcohol, despite the importance of this from a Catholic theological perspective. And so the text it's extraordinarily rich.
Last question, when is your book coming out and what's the focus?
When?
How would you describe it? No, we all don't know when our books are going to come out. Even I don't, but...
I'm hoping to finish the final revisions this year, and then, depending on what I can find...
And the focus would be?
The focus is, I'm really trying to work out an argument between, how the Jesuits within the Portuguese Empire negotiated these kind of twin commitments between conversion, spreading universal Catholicism, and their commitment to the Portuguese crown. And so that's what the book is going to be about.
Thank you so much.